My name is Stephanie Caldwell. I'm 35, from Virginia. On Christmas night, my husband served me divorce papers in front of his entire family. He thought I'd cry. His friends had even placed a bet on it. But instead, I smiled, signed them, then handed him a gold-wrapped box. He laughed until he opened it, because inside wasn't a gift. It was proof that the knife he gave me a year ago had just slit his entire future wide open. Before I tell you everything, tell me, where are you listening from right now? Drop it in the comments. I read every single one. Do you think she'll cry when she sees them? Nate's voice floated from the living room, thick with the cloying scent of pine and something else, something malicious. Laughter followed, a low, guttural rumble that seemed to vibrate through the very floorboards beneath me. Women always do, Brandon said, his voice laced with the kind of casual cruelty that had become his signature, a subtle hum beneath the surface of our lives. They didn't know I was behind the door, holding a steaming mug of eggnog, the warmth a stark contrast to the sudden chill that spread through my limbs. They didn't know I had already heard enough, not just from this conversation, but from 1,000 tiny betrayals that had paved the way to this precise, unbearable moment. Brandon didn't know the version of me he once mocked for being too sensitive. The woman he had meticulously, painstakingly chipped away at, had already prepared for this night. He believed he held all the cards, that my tears were a given, a predictable finale to his carefully orchestrated drama. But the woman he thought he knew, the one who would crumble, had ceased to exist. She had been quietly, painstakingly, rebuilt from the inside out, fortified by every slight, every dismissive glance, every cutting remark veiled as a joke. The only thing about to break was his perception of me, and in turn, his meticulously constructed world. The air grew thick with their anticipation, a silent countdown to my supposed downfall, but all I felt was a strange, cold calm, a sense of clarity that had been a long time coming. This wasn't just about tonight, it was about every hidden wound, every whispered doubt, every moment I had allowed myself to be defined by his expectations. And tonight, those expectations would be shattered, not by a scream, but by a smile. Have you ever been betrayed by the people who were supposed to protect you? Before the storm, there was a quiet, almost idyllic existence, painted in hues of soft morning light and the comfortable rhythm of shared routines. We lived in a house that breathed history, a charming old Victorian in a tree-lined neighborhood. I remember the way the sun would filter through the stained glass window in the entryway, casting jewel-toned patterns across the polished wood floor. In those days, our mornings began with the scent of brewing coffee and Brandon's low murmur as he read the newspaper, his voice a steadying presence. I'd be in the kitchen, carefully arranging slices of avocado on toast, listening to the birds chirp outside the open window. It was simple, unadorned, and in my memory, achingly beautiful. We'd walk our golden retriever, Leo, through the park, his tail wagging a steady beat against our legs. Brandon would sometimes reach for my hand, his fingers intertwining with mine, a familiar warmth that promised security. We'd talk about mundane things, the latest neighborhood gossip, the upcoming weekend plans, the progress of the hydrangeas I was trying to coax into bloom in the backyard. There was a lightness to those conversations, an easy camaraderie that felt like the bedrock of our life together. Our evenings were often spent curled on the sofa, a cashmere throw draped over us, watching old movies or reading in comfortable silence. Sometimes, he'd read aloud from a book of poetry, his voice a soothing baritone, and I'd trace the lines of his jaw, feeling a contentment so profound it bordered on pain. He had a way of making me feel seen, cherished in those moments. He'd bring me a cup of tea just as I was settling into a good book, or tuck a stray strand of hair behind my ear with a tenderness that made my heart ache. We hosted dinner parties frequently, our home filled with the laughter of friends, the clinking of glasses, and the rich aroma of my slow-cooked meals. Brandon was the consummate host, charming and attentive, drawing everyone into his orbit. I'd watch him, a quiet pride swelling in my chest, convinced I had found my person, my safe harbor. I remember one autumn afternoon, we were raking leaves in the yard, the crisp air carrying the scent of wood smoke. He stopped, leaned on his rake, and looked at me, a playful glint in his eyes. "You know," he said, "sometimes I still can't believe this is our life." And I'd smiled back, my heart full, believing him completely. He'd planned a surprise birthday trip for me once, to a small cottage by the lake. We spent days hiking, cooking together, and simply existing in each other's presence. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in fiery oranges and purples, he held me close, his chin resting on my head. "You're my everything, Steph," he'd whispered, and I felt it deeply, truly, with every fiber of my being. Our life was built on these small, familiar moments, these quiet assurances. They weren't grand gestures, but they were the threads that wove the tapestry of our shared existence, creating a sense of comfort and intimacy that felt unbreakable. We had inside jokes, shared memories that no one else understood, a language spoken only between us. There were the lazy Sunday mornings, tangled in sheets, the gentle murmur of our conversations before the world woke up. There was the way he'd hum off-key when he was happy, and the way I'd instinctively finish his sentences. These were the foundations of our love, or what I believed was love. This was the calm before, a calm so profound and seemingly unshakable that the coming storm would feel like a betrayal not just of trust, but of reality itself. And that, I would learn, was the cruelest part of all, to lose something so deeply ingrained, so utterly believed, that its absence left not just a void, but a phantom limb ache where comfort once resided. The first cracks were almost imperceptible, like hairline fractures in a perfectly glazed teacup. They weren't sudden explosions, but quiet shifts, subtle alterations in the atmospheric pressure of our lives. It started with small things, easily dismissed, easily rationalized. A dismissive wave of his hand when I tried to share a detail about my day, a fleeting shadow in his eyes when I brought up plans for the future. He'd start staying out later, not with grand excuses, but with vague murmurs about client dinners or unexpected meetings. At first, I'd worry, send him a text to make sure he was okay. He'd reply hours later, a terse "fine," that felt like a slap. Then came the silences. Not the comfortable silences we once shared, but heavy, pregnant pauses that stretched between us, filled with unsaid words and unasked questions. I'd try to bridge them, to fill the void with chatter about my work, my friends, anything to dispel the growing unease. But his responses grew shorter, his gaze more distant. He started looking through me, not at me, as if I were a translucent pane of glass he was merely passing through. My gut, that quiet, insistent voice, began to whisper. It was a faint tremor at first, a feeling of unease that would prickle at the back of my neck. I'd find myself replaying conversations, searching for hidden meanings, for the exact moment when the shift occurred. Had I said something wrong? Done something to upset him? The self-doubt, a familiar companion from my childhood, began to creep back in, insidious and slow. I started to second-guess my perceptions, to dismiss my own feelings as overreactions. He was just stressed, I told myself. Work was demanding. We were just in a rut, a natural phase of marriage. But the seeds of doubt were planted. There were the odd absences of his wedding ring, explained away by a casual, "Oh, I took it off to work out and forgot to put it back on." Or the sudden protectiveness over his phone, always face down, always just out of my reach. Once, I saw a text notification pop up, a woman's name, unfamiliar, followed by a winking emoji. My heart lurched, a cold, sickening drop. When I asked, his eyes hardened, just for a moment, before he plastered on a dismissive smile. "Just a new colleague, Steph. Don't be so paranoid." And I, desperate to believe him, desperate to preserve the fragile peace, let it go. He began to subtly undermine me in front of others. A joke about my cooking that wasn't funny, a comment about my scatterbrained nature, delivered with a charming laugh that made everyone else chuckle along. I'd force a smile, my cheeks burning, feeling the familiar shrinking sensation take hold. It was never outright cruelty, always veiled, always plausible deniability. That's what made it so insidious. It chipped away at my self-worth, leaving me feeling increasingly exposed and vulnerable. The unease deepened. I found myself walking on eggshells, constantly gauging his mood, trying to anticipate his reactions. The vibrant, confident woman I had been before him, the one who laughed too loudly and wore red, was slowly fading, replaced by a muted, cautious version of myself. I stopped initiating conversations about our future, fearing his indifference. I stopped making grand plans, fearing his dismissiveness. The silence between us grew, not just the absence of words, but the absence of connection, of shared joy, of genuine intimacy. The air in our beautiful home, once so warm and inviting, now felt thin, almost brittle. I was living in a constant state of low-level dread, a background hum of anxiety that never quite left me. I knew, in the deepest part of my being, that something was profoundly wrong, even if I couldn't yet name it. The storm wasn't just coming, it was already swirling, quietly, beneath the surface of my seemingly perfect life, waiting for the moment to erupt and shatter everything I believed to be true. The truth, when it arrived, didn't roar. It whispered, a soft, insidious hiss that slithered into the silence of our meticulously curated Christmas Eve. We were at his parents' house, the air thick with the scent of pine and roast turkey, the festive cheer a cruel counterpoint to the quiet devastation unfolding within me. I was helping his mother clear the dinner plates, the clatter of ceramic against ceramic a rhythmic, almost meditative sound. Brandon had excused himself, claiming a need to check on something in the study. It was a lie, of course. I knew it in my bones. I walked past the study door, intending to go to the kitchen. The door was ajar, a sliver of light escaping into the darkened hallway. And then I heard it, not a shout, not a confrontation, but a low, confident chuckle. Brandon's voice. And another, distinctly female, equally confident. Curiosity, a dull, aching thing, pulled me closer. I paused, my hand hovering over the doorknob, my breath catching in my throat. "She has no idea," I heard Brandon say, his voice laced with a smug satisfaction that twisted my stomach. "Still thinks we're playing house. It's almost too easy." Then the other voice, sharp and familiar. "Well, darling, you did tell her she was too sensitive to handle the truth. You laid the groundwork for this perfectly." It was Beth, my sister. My own sister. The words hit me with the physical force of a blow, stealing the air from my lungs. I stumbled back, my hand flying to my mouth to stifle a gasp. The teacup I was holding slipped from my grasp, shattering on the polished wood floor with a deafening crash that seemed to echo the fracturing of my world. They paused. Silence. Then Brandon's voice, closer now, a note of irritation. "What was that?" I stood frozen, shards of ceramic sparkling on the floor like scattered diamonds, each one reflecting a splinter of my shattered reality. My mind reeled, grasping for purchase, for a different interpretation, a kinder explanation. But there was none. Their words, so casual, so cruel, were a poison that seeped into every memory, every shared smile, every whispered promise. The easy laughter, the comforting silences, the loving glances, they were all lies. A meticulously crafted illusion. My legs felt like lead, my chest constricted, a vice squeezing the air from my lungs. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. There was just a profound, overwhelming silence, both within me and around me. The festive sounds of Christmas, the carols, the distant chatter, faded into a muffled hum, as if I had suddenly been plunged underwater. All that remained was the ringing in my ears, the thumping of my own heart, a desperate drumbeat against the silence of my internal collapse. The world I trusted, the world I had built my entire identity around, no longer existed. It was a stage, and I was the unsuspecting player, dancing to a script I hadn't read, my role merely to be the unsuspecting victim. The pain wasn't a sharp stab, but a dull, pervasive ache that spread through every cell of my body, a cold, heavy weight that pressed down on me, threatening to crush me. I remember staring at the scattered pieces of the teacup, my vision blurring. Each shard was a fragment of my life, a piece of a dream shattered beyond repair. The betrayal was so complete, so absolute, that it left no room for anger, only a profound, dizzying emptiness. It wasn't just Brandon, it was Beth. The one person I had confided in, the one person I had trusted with my deepest fears and vulnerabilities, had been complicit. The depth of that treachery was a chasm I couldn't comprehend. I felt a strange dissociation, as if I were watching myself from above, a silent observer to my own devastation. The woman standing there, frozen amidst the broken ceramic, felt like a stranger. Her hopes, her dreams, her very sense of self had been systematically dismantled, piece by agonizing piece. The tears, when they finally came, weren't a torrent, but a slow, silent trickle, tracing cold paths down my cheeks. They were tears not of sadness, but of desolation, of a profound and irreparable loss. The world had gone quiet, and in that silence, I was left alone with the echoes of their laughter and the shattering realization that everything I had believed was a lie. The air grew heavy, thick with the residue of betrayal, and I knew, with chilling certainty, that nothing would ever be the same again. This was the moment I broke, not with a scream, but with an internal implosion, a silent descent into a void where trust and love had once resided. The collapse wasn't a static event, it was a process. After that moment by the study door, a different kind of quiet settled over me. It wasn't the silence of despair, but the stillness of deep, cold strategy. There was no room for screaming, no energy for dramatic confrontations. The initial shock had given way to a terrifying clarity, a sharp focus I hadn't known I possessed. My world had shattered, but the pieces, though painful to look at, offered a new perspective. I began to observe. Not with a magnifying glass, but with the dispassionate gaze of a scientist studying an alien specimen. Brandon's every move, every word, became data. His dismissive jokes, once swallowed with a forced smile, were now catalogued, analyzed, filed away. His late nights, once a source of anxiety, became entries in a meticulous log. I started keeping a small, leather-bound notebook, its pages filled with cryptic symbols and shorthand. Star in my planner for every time he came home after midnight. A quick note about the new watch he was wearing, the one I hadn't seen before. A tally mark for every expense I didn't make, every mysterious charge on our joint account. My internal monologue shifted from self-pity to calculated assessment. He thinks he's so clever. He thinks I'm blind. This thought, devoid of emotion, became my constant companion. I started taking screenshots of emails, of texts I found, of anything that seemed remotely out of place. It was like assembling a puzzle, each piece small and innocuous on its own, but forming a devastating picture when put together. I learned to move through our shared life like a ghost, present but unseen, listening, watching, collecting. He thought I was softening, that the blows had finally broken my spirit. He saw my quietness as defeat, my lack of protest as resignation. He had no idea I was recording. To him, I was folding, retreating into the predictable shell of a wounded woman. He'd come home, occasionally, with an almost patronizing tenderness, a casual arm around my shoulder, a perfunctory kiss on the forehead. I'd lean into it, feigning vulnerability, letting him believe he was still in control, still the puppeteer pulling my strings. Each feigned moment of weakness was a calculated move, drawing him deeper into his own false sense of security. The idea of revenge, in the traditional sense, held no appeal. There was no catharsis in anger, no satisfaction in a loud, messy fight. What I wanted was something quieter, more profound, reclamation. I wanted my life back, my dignity, my future. And for that, I needed proof. I needed undeniable, irrefutable evidence of his deceit. This wasn't about punishing him, it was about protecting myself and something else, something precious that was beginning to stir within me. One evening, after he had left for another client dinner, I sat at my laptop, the screen illuminating my face in the dark. I wasn't searching for anything specific, just following a gut feeling. And there it was, an email, buried deep in an old folder, a conversation between Brandon and Nate. It was dated a year ago, just after we'd gotten married. They were discussing prenups and a joke Brandon had made about signing one on a napkin. A cold shiver ran down my spine. The napkin. The drunken, dismissive scribble of his name. He had forgotten it, but I hadn't. I had taken it, folded it carefully, and tucked it away. It had been a fleeting thought then, a strange instinct. Now it was a lifeline. The next day, I called Jenny. She was my oldest friend, fiercely loyal, brutally honest. I didn't tell her everything, not yet. Just enough to get her help. I need a lawyer, Jenny. A good one. Discreet. She asked no questions, simply gave me a number. The first meeting was terrifying. I laid out the fragments, the hushed conversations, the financial discrepancies, the growing coldness. And then I pulled out the napkin, crisp and almost forgotten. The lawyer's eyes, initially skeptical, widened. "This," she said, her voice low, "changes everything." That was the night I stopped being his wife, in spirit, and started being his reckoning. The seed of transformation had been planted, nurtured in the quiet darkness of betrayal, and it was beginning to unfurl, strong and resilient. I wasn't afraid anymore. I was ready. The quiet planning had given way to a palpable tension, a hum beneath the surface of my everyday life. It felt like the drawn-out silence before a lightning strike, potent with unspoken power. Brandon, oblivious in his carefully constructed world of deceit, continued his charade. He'd come home, feign affection, and subtly probe for any signs of weakness in me, any crack in the facade I presented. He thought he was smart. He thought he was in control. And that, I realized, was his gravest miscalculation. The turn came not with a roar, but with a whisper. He chose Christmas dinner, a setting he believed would amplify my humiliation, make my fall public and spectacular. He saw it as his grand finale, a clean, swift cut to sever our ties and secure his future. He approached me with a practiced casualness, a slight smirk playing on his lips, the envelope held loosely in his hand. "Happy holidays, babe," he said, his eyes glinting with a smug satisfaction, as if he were handing me a present. Nate, his equally odious friend, let out a snicker from across the table. My heart didn't pound. My hands didn't tremble. A strange, serene calm had settled over me, a feeling of absolute certainty. This was it. The culmination of months of quiet observation, of meticulously piecing together the fragments of his betrayal. I took the envelope from him, my fingers brushing against his, and I saw a flicker of triumph in his eyes. He expected tears, a dramatic collapse. He expected me to be the weeping wife, the broken woman. I opened it slowly, deliberately, the crisp rustle of the paper the loudest sound in the suddenly hushed dining room. My gaze swept over the legal jargon, the cold, impersonal language of divorce papers. My eyes landed on his signature, bold and arrogant. And then I reached into my purse, a small, gold-wrapped box nestled at the bottom. The same box I had intended to give him, once upon a time, filled with a meaningful, thoughtful gift. But the meaning had changed. I pulled out a pen, its click echoing in the silence. With a steady hand, I signed the papers, dated them, and looked up, meeting his gaze. His smirk faltered, replaced by a flicker of confusion. "Thanks for the formality," I said, my voice clear and level, without a hint of emotion. His eyes narrowed, searching my face for the expected unraveling. But he found nothing. I leaned forward, the gold-wrapped box in my hand, and extended it to him. "Here," I said, "I have something for you too." He hesitated, then took the box, his brow furrowed in suspicion. Nate and the rest of his family watched, a silent tableau of anticipation. He unwrapped it, the paper tearing away to reveal a sleek, professional-looking document. His eyes scanned the first few lines, then the next, and I watched as the color drained from his face. It was a fully executed prenup, his signature bold and undeniable, notarized, time-stamped, reinforced by my attorney. The very napkin he had scrawled his name on, dismissed as a drunken joke, was meticulously attached, a stark reminder of his carelessness. His jaw tightened, a muscle jumping in his cheek. His pride, that towering edifice he had built around himself, cracked. The air around him seemed to deflate, his arrogance replaced by a dawning, terrifying realization. And then, with a slow, deliberate movement, I reached into my bag once more, pulling out one last item. A sonogram. A black and white image, ethereal and profound. 8 weeks. Heartbeat strong. Our child. I watched him, my voice a soft murmur that only he could hear, a quiet counterpoint to the shattered silence of the room. You bet I'd cry, I whispered, each word a gentle push against his crumbling facade. You laughed. But I wasn't planning. I paused, letting the weight of my next words sink in, letting them echo in the suddenly suffocating quiet. I was preparing. Around the table, no one spoke. Not his parents, who sat rigid, their faces a mask of shock. Not Nate, who looked like a deer caught in headlights. Not even Beth, my sister, who just reached under the table, her hand finding mine, squeezing it tight. In that moment, the power shifted. Not with a shout or a dramatic accusation, but with a quiet, dignified reveal. The revenge was not loud, it was absolute. And it was earned. He walked out. There was no dramatic exit, no shouted threats, just a sudden, desperate lunge for the door. He left the prenup, the ultrasound, and the shredded illusion of his control scattered on the polished dining table, a testament to his hubris. The silence he left behind was profound, heavier than any spoken word. His parents stared at the debris, then at me, their faces etched with a mixture of shock and dawning comprehension. Nate, his friend, looked away, his bravado utterly evaporated. Beth, my sister, remained beside me, her hand a warm anchor in the cold reality of the room. I stayed. I didn't chase him. I didn't gloat. There was no triumphant feeling, just a deep, weary sense of something finally being over. I simply turned back to the table and, with a quiet strength that surprised even myself, began to clear the plates. Later, I served the pie, the warm, comforting scent a stark contrast to the earlier tension. I made polite conversation, answered questions with a calm detachment, and went to bed that night, for the first time in years, sleeping soundly. The fallout for Brandon was not a spectacle I orchestrated. It was a slow, insidious unraveling, the natural consequence of his actions. The carefully constructed image he had cultivated, the charming, successful man of integrity, began to fray at the edges. News travels fast in certain circles, especially when money and reputation are involved. His business associates, hearing whispers, began to distance themselves. His casual cruelty, once dismissed as banter, was now seen for what it was. The bets he'd made, the callous jokes, all began to boomerang back at him. He found himself isolated, not because I actively campaigned against him, but because the truth, once exposed, had a way of speaking for itself. He started to feel the weight of his actions, not because I punished him, but because the consequences caught up. His name didn't carry the weight it once did, not even at work. The power he had wielded, the control he had craved, slipped through his fingers the moment he believed I had none. Meanwhile, I healed. Slowly, quietly, I began to reclaim my life, piece by painstaking piece. The first few weeks were a haze of doctor's appointments, legal meetings, and the gentle, unwavering support of Jenny and Beth. They were my silent guardians, helping me navigate the paperwork, the nausea, the overwhelming surge of emotions. My home, once a stage for his performance, became my sanctuary. I repainted the living room a soft, calming blue, hung new curtains that let in more light, and filled every corner with the things that brought me peace. I started taking long walks in the park, the crisp air a balm to my raw nerves. I rediscovered old hobbies, painting, reading novels that transported me to different worlds. I learned to cook nourishing meals, not out of obligation, but out of a deep desire to nurture the life growing within me. Each day was a small victory, a tiny step away from the shadow he had cast. There were moments of profound sadness, yes, fleeting echoes of the past, but they were quickly overshadowed by a burgeoning sense of freedom. The greatest healing, however, came from within. With each passing week, as my daughter grew stronger inside me, so did I. The fear, the self-doubt, the lingering insecurities he had instilled began to dissipate. I started sleeping diagonally, sprawled across the entire bed, a small, rebellious act of reclaiming my space. I laughed with Jenny in the kitchen, a genuine, uninhibited sound that echoed through the house, no longer needing to scan a face for approval. I allowed myself to be vulnerable, to lean on the people who truly loved me, without fear of judgment or betrayal. I was rebuilding not just a life, but myself. The process was messy, sometimes painful, but it was mine. Every stretch mark, every ache, every new flutter within me was a reminder of the life I was creating, a life free from his toxicity. He paid monthly, quietly, his financial obligations a silent acknowledgement of his defeat. His presence in my life was reduced to a cold, transactional exchange, devoid of power, devoid of emotion. And with each payment, I felt a little more free, a little more untethered from the wreckage of our past. I was breathing freely, sleeping soundly, and finding a quiet joy in the simplest of moments. This wasn't just about survival anymore, it was about thriving. It was about creating a legacy of strength and resilience, a testament to the fact that even from the deepest betrayal, a beautiful, new beginning can emerge. The path from betrayal to liberation is not a straight line, nor is it paved with forgotten memories. It's a winding journey, marked by quiet victories and moments of profound clarity. Closure, I learned, isn't about erasing the past, but about outgrowing the pain it inflicted. Brandon's shadow no longer looms over me. His name doesn't stir anger or bitterness, but a quiet, almost academic understanding of a chapter closed. He is simply a part of my story, a necessary catalyst for the woman I have become. My daughter is now a vibrant, curious 2-year-old, her laughter the sweetest melody I've ever heard. She is the sun in my sky, a constant reminder of the strength forged in the crucible of adversity. When I look at her, I don't see the wreckage of a past relationship. I see the boundless potential of a future built on love, resilience, and unwavering self-worth. I am free. Not because I forgot the sting of his betrayal, but because I outgrew the pain. It's a scar now, a faint line on my soul, a testament to what I endured and what I overcame. It reminds me of my capacity for strength, for forgiveness, not for him, but for myself, for the choices I made, and for absolute self-preservation. There is no bitterness, no drama, just a profound sense of peace. I carry my life like a crown, not adorned with jewels, but with the quiet dignity of a woman who has walked through hell and emerged, not unscathed, but unbroken. My home is filled with laughter now, the genuine kind that bubbles up from the depths of my being. I've found a community of incredible women, fierce and supportive, who remind me every day of the power of connection and authentic relationships. I'm no longer scanning faces for approval, no longer shrinking to fit someone else's expectations. I speak my mind, wear the colors that make me feel vibrant, and laugh as loudly as I want. This strength isn't a performance, it's an intrinsic part of who I am. The quiet reclaiming of my life continues, not as a struggle, but as a joyful unfolding. Every time my daughter kicks against my chest in her sleep, every time she reaches for my hand, a wave of profound gratitude washes over me. I remember the moment I reclaimed us, not with fire, not with revenge, but with the kind of peace only a woman who's walked through hell can carry like a crown. Have you found your way back from betrayal? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one.